Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be able to welcome you, our virtual audience, to Humanities Decanted. At the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, we created this series as a platform for humanities and arts faculty to share their newest scholarly and creative work with the campus and the public. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the director of the IHC. I do want to let you know that our conversation today will last for about 30 minutes, after which we will take audience questions for 10 minutes. At any time during the event, you can use the Q&A feature on your screen to submit your questions. This event is being recorded and will be available on the IHC website in 2 weeks. Before I introduce our interlocutors, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Professors Swati Rana and Stephanie Batiste. Professor Rana is an assistant professor in the English department, specializing in 20th century American literature, comparative ethnic literature, and transnational American studies. She is also the director of the American Cultures and Global Context Center. She has published literary criticism in journals such as American Literature, American Literary History, and the Journal of Asian American Studies, and her creative writing has appeared in numerous periodicals, including the Paris Review, Crazy Horse, and the Asian American Literary Review. Her poetry also appears in Indivisible, an anthology of contemporary South Asian American poetry. Professor Rana's research has received support from numerous agencies, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the IHC. Today, she will be in conversation about her new book, Race Characters, Ethnic Literature and the Figure of the American Dream, which appeared last year with University of North Carolina Press. And she will be speaking with Stephanie Batiste. Professor Batiste is an associate professor of Black Studies and an affiliate professor in the departments of theater and dance and comparative literature. Her research areas include race and racism, performance studies, and African American literature and culture. A scholar, poet, performer, and playwright, she has published a monograph entitled Darkening Mirrors, Imperial Representation in Depression-Era African-American Performance, as well as interdisciplinary essays in anthologies and journals, including Text and Performance Quarterly, The Black Scholar, and the New Centennial Review. It is my great pleasure to welcome Swati and Stephanie to the virtual IHC to converse about Swati's new book.
Thank you, Susan, for that warm introduction, and to the IHC for having me here today. Thank you also to Adam Morrison and Paula Schaefer for facilitating and curating the event, and Stephanie Batiste for joining me. And thank you all for being here today on this Thursday afternoon. So my book began with a social figure, the visibly racialized immigrant, who embraces certain shibboleths of the American dream, from assimilation to upward mobility. Think of public figures like Kamala Harris, Bharati Mukherjee, Colin Powell, Richard Rodriguez, Eric Liu, who represent, albeit in very different ways, the triumph of the American dream and of the immigrant generations that produced them. Having constructed elaborate literary personas themselves, they bring to mind other figures in the ethnic archive who do not fit neatly into a resistance-based paradigm. Writers like Claude McKay and Ved Mehta, who are anywhere from capricious to taciturn about the politics of race, or accommodationist and assimilationist writers like Mary Antin, Maria Ruiz de Burton, or Booker T. Washington, who strain the boundaries of an oppositional framework. I grappled with how to reckon with such figures, with their potent appeal and their facile deployments, their promise to expiate the country's racial sins and perpetuate the exceptionalist ideal of the American dream. I kept circling back to this surprising citation by a sitting US president from a work of Arab American literature almost 100 years after its initial publication, which enlists the author, Ameen Rihani, in the service of US empire. I wanted to discover the tools literary critique could offer. I knew we must read these figures, but how exactly? This is where my research began to coalesce around the concept of character. it struck me that the American dream, with its varied and interchangeable contents, was actually driven by character in the sense that it represents outsized personalities whose stories, achievements, character really, in the sense of their distinctive yet replicable personalities, are meant to enrich our own. Scholars in ethnic and literary studies have built rich lexicons for thinking through such figures and thinking beyond resistance. And you can actually see here Professor Stephanie Batiste's book, Darkening Mirrors, as well as work by my colleagues Felice Blake and Ben Olguin. I sensed that literary criticism had something unique to contribute to this lexicon, especially insofar as character critique can be retooled for thinking about race, power, and difference. My book develops a new hermeneutic in race character critique. I show that characterization and racialization are linked social processes and practices of social reading. Enlisting the concept of character, its formal, theoretical, and discursive range, I fashion a method that links literary representations of character to the biographical contexts and diasporic histories that shape them. Mapping out a spectrum of gradations between author and character, race character critique refracts a singular sense of personhood into plural, heterogeneous personas. It charts the relation of these many parts of character, especially the character of the author, which it disarticulates from fictive character, even as it brings these parts into a conversant whole. Take a look at this portrait of Dalip Singh Saund that hangs in the US Capitol, commemorating his historic election as the first Asian American member of Congress. Saund's triumphal journey rests upon a particular imagination of his character, backed by neoclassical architecture, shorn of his hair and wearing the drapery of a Western suit. We're invited to read him as having character and to read through him American, national, US national character, aided by the array of symbols in the frame and their story of progressive assimilation. There are other characters here, politicians, public leaders, farmers, alphabetic characters painted in such a way as to evoke the Greek root of character, meaning to engrave or furrow, gestures to Saund's autobiography and to other multiples of protagonist, narrator, and author. The miniature of the young turbaned Saund in particular looks out from the margins, conjuring the very difference that the central portrait seeks to efface. The characters engraved below register the history of colonialism, racism, and nativism that the autobiography traces and that the central portrait disavows. While the frame is meant to contain these contradictions, it casts them into relief, collapsing the central figure of Saund. My chapters study the interplay of these many versions of character across the work of Paule Marshall, Ameen Rihani, José Antonio Villarreal, José Garcia Villa, and Dalip Singh Saund, immigrant writers who are situated in a nascent period of ethnic identification from 1900 to 1960. They represent vexed attachments to the American dream, either in their work or within the historical record, championing imperialist intervention, severing art from biography, betraying racial identity, assuming the mantle of model minority, or embracing upward mobility. I read the compulsive hyperproduction of their characters, their overlapping fields of characterization, their discursive and structural building of character, showing ultimately that characterization is contestation. Race characters critically engages with the American dream precisely through characters that appear to exemplify its ideology, tracing the distinctions between author, narrator, and persona across literary and social worlds. My readings break down the protagonist of the American dream and generate a fundamental shift from personality to society, discovering behind the draw or repulse of individual character the structural forces that compel artistic choices. A fuller picture of ethnic identity emerges, shaped by necessity and by constraint. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swati, for that beautiful and precise, wonderful description of your book. I'm just hoping, at least in the beginning of our conversation, we can spend some time pulling apart some of those ideas that you give us with such beautiful language in your brief slideshow. The first question is really an obvious one, but I think one that's one of the more important ones for thinking about your work and how it enters the world. Can you tell us what's important generally about studying immigrants to the US?
Mhm.
Might seem obvious, but I think it's something that's important for us to think about together.
No, absolutely. And I think, it's also a question that I came to when I was looking at my archive and trying to select, and it was something I grappled with, why these figures in particular. And to me, immigrants, when they enter into the US, enter into the American dream story. And so immigrant literature is a record of how they grapple with that plot line or that story. And it solicits immigrants in very different ways. So the South Asian Indian immigrant is going to be solicited very differently from the Barbadian immigrant, right, from the Caribbean. So that's the site where they negotiate that plot and figure out how to insert themselves into it and develop either a sort of, a capitulation, although maybe that's not the right word, but they sort of embark on the American dream narrative, or they critique it. And the dynamics of characterization kind of reveal this. So, I'm thinking of Paule Marshall's work that I was gesturing to, and she's a second generation Barbadian immigrant, and the Brown Gold Brownstones, which is the novel I read, is really invested in kind of understanding the American dream, understanding what Black West Indian upward mobility might look like, and also placing it in this matrix of characterization within the novel that allows us then to understand its function and its limits. So, someone like the central protagonist of that work gets taken out by sociologists at that moment to justify arguments about Black pathology, for instance. Scylla is this very powerful figure of upward mobility. But then if we reinsert her back into the work, try to read her intention with her daughter, look at the building and the brownstone as framing their characters and the constraints they face, then a whole different critique can emerge of the American dream. So I think that's why I settled on that archive, is that it really engages with that plot and with the central figure of the dream.
Yeah, and simply the US once was considered a nation of immigrants, right? The idea that fundamentally, and I know that you teach this in some of your undergraduate courses, the immigration history to the US, and the changing conception of what US national belonging is.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's a history of really specific, often anti-immigration laws that were nation and race-based. And so to think in literature from 1900 to 1960 about the constitution of the nation and what it means to have a raced identity. And when you're talking about racialized characters, you're talking about immigrants from places that are not visibly white, like Europeans.
Yeah, and they're situated in this period that you point to from 1900 to 1960, which we understand in terms of the European immigration more fully. I think the story of the making of white ethnicity, right, where Southern and Eastern European immigrants in that period assimilate. They're ethnicized. They get to dream and live the American dream. But what we don't understand fully, I think, is how non-European immigrants negotiate that trajectory. And again, this is a different racial regime in many ways of overt exclusion, racially based denaturalization policies, Jim Crow segregation. And so there's a kind of vexed genealogy of Americanization there, where clearly non-European immigrants don't follow the same pattern and the same analogy of immigration, but they also are grappling with their position kind of at this pivot between race and ethnicity. And that's partly where I found a lot of these characters having this kind of asymptotic relationship to the American dream, like drawn to its template, its figuration, its plot, but also unable as racialized subjects to actually realize that trajectory. So Saund, he has to grapple with the fact that he can't naturalize as an immigrant from the Indian subcontinent. And that contradiction is all over his autobiography, right? He's the first congressman from India. He eventually is able to naturalize, but how does he account for the fact that this, American democracy that supposedly kind of welcomes him into the fold presents this formidable barrier, right, at the same time?
I have two questions. The first is, can you tell us what kinds of things you mean when you say the American dream? And what kinds of things you mean when you say some people embark on it and some people critique it? And then given your analysis of Saund's autobiography, I'm really interested in the way autobiography as a text gives us an individual story, and how there's a tension between individual story and race making, ethnicity making within this framework. Because it seems like telling an individual story through autobiography is in some sense a gesture towards individuality, something that's woven into an American dream aesthetic or ethos. And so I'm just wondering, in those two parts, whether you can tell us some of the things you mean by the American dream. I know it seems obvious to people, maybe, but I think probably the research that you've done both expands and specifies what that might be.
Mm-hmm. So the American dream, you circle around this concept, right? It's almost impossible to write a book about the American dream, which I realized quite early on, even though my book is about the American dream, ostensibly. And I think what I ultimately realized grappling with and doing the research was that it has interchangeable content. The American dream is the horizon of limitless possibilities, right? And there are strands which certainly come up in and weave in and out of my readings. One being the sort of rags to riches romance, fortune to be had in the new world, and which is actually not exactly compatible with the other strand of this kind of bootstrap ideology, work hard and you'll get rewarded and you'll succeed, right? The ethos of individualism, fair play, sportsmanship, it's a fairly masculinist ethos that's kind of woven into it. So I traced those lines especially through someone like Saund, who is promulgating that notion in his writing. But also that I sort of realized that I was really interested in the formal structure of the American dream, that at its heart, it seems to have this character or this protagonist that we're supposed to sort of identify with, and who is supposed to be entirely exceptional in some ways, but also fully replicable to the extent that we're supposed to kind of model ourselves on this figure. And so that's where I sort of landed with the American dream, that it was popularized in the period that these writers are writing, around 1930s, and it has this character that is almost like a template for ethnic literature. That ethnic writers sort of have this fragment or the outline of this character, which is why I don't, in the image on my cover, it's by artist Sadia Rahman, and to me it was very suggestive because there's this flag and these figures in the foreground it's like a template that ethnic literature has to engage with. And so when you get to the second part of your question, right, that Saund, in writing the autobiography of a congressman from India, it's called Congressman from India, he's engaging with that template. And so he's telling a highly sort of what appears to be a highly individualized story of success, right? But at the same time, the point of that as its propaganda function, its role within his campaigns and his sort of role as an American representative, that text is there to give that story to his constituency. And then all sorts of gaps emerge, right, in the telling. Like, how is he going to write a chapter about naturalization while, making this overarching argument about American democracy during the Cold War that will paper over the very real differences, the real struggles that people are facing at that time, right? So he goes around the world he calls it as a living example of democracy in action. And so he's constantly having to negotiate what you describe as this kind of highly individualized mode of the genre of autobiography, which also then has to be engaging with notions of what it means to be American, what American character is. So in a way, individual character is kind of seamlessly constructing national character at that moment.
Yeah, and you draw us into this use of character that we often throw around and throw away, right? American character. And what is so fascinating to me is that we're quite familiar too with characters and protagonists in novels and stories without thinking about, you know, American character as a framework that already exists, that these stories then play around with and through, are saddled by. There's actually a lack of freedom of expression that happens when the writing begins, because there's this pre-existing figure, this empty structure, this groove that's represented on the cover of your book, that the writers are in battle with. It doesn't make their identities secondary, but it does, as you show us, chart a really thorny, particular, woven pathway, vexed pathway to something like being, right? And what does it mean to be now an American yourself and your children? And it seemed, you know, probably at a moment there's this era where we were telling ourselves that it didn't matter, that race didn't matter, that racism didn't exist, that you know, immigrants were Americans as long as they weren't Black. And we've come to a new era in the 21st century, even though the American story is one of progress, where we realize very clearly, or the public realizes more clearly, that this racial story, these immigrant stories, are complicated, vexed, overlapping, and entangled. When you tell us about each novel from 1900 to 1960, you're also giving us a kind of alternative history to, you know, a mainstream white male European history of conquest and expanding democracy and, you know, making it, right? Can you tell us a little about the ways the history that you find shifts the story that we tell ourselves about American belonging and inclusion?
That's a great question. I think it's about, let me see if this answers it. So obviously there's not a teleology, right? So that's in a way, the barest version of that ideology, that, okay, you come, you assimilate. And this was described as sort of the immigrant analogy, right? Of the making of whiteness, of white ethnicization. So Southern and Eastern European immigrants are allowed to kind of, are able to follow this trajectory in a certain way. But then what do we do with non-European immigrants who aren't able to kind of avail themselves of that trajectory? And even so, there are sites where, you know, if we think of race on the one hand and ethnicity on the other, race morphs into ethnicity, as Susan Koshy has that formulation. And I talk about it a bit more as a pivot, that, you know, on the one hand, someone like Saund is trying to tell the story of his ethnicization and becoming American. And on the other hand, he can't sustain it. It just keeps falling apart, right? So, I mean, I think fundamentally it's moving from a kind of teleological notion of history and of assimilation and of Americanization. And, you know, we're familiar with that if we think about, you know, a genealogy from Yellow Peril to Model Minority, which is another story we also tell as a kind of progressive story. But actually there's a real precarity here, right? That the prize of, if you ever achieve it, of becoming American can be withdrawn and withheld at any time. And that the cost of that, you know, I mean, I think Toni Morrison said this in 1993, I think, you know, on the backs of Blacks. It's a piece in Time magazine. She's saying that Americanization happens Americanization for immigrant groups takes the form of anti-Black racism, right? So I think it underscores the precarity of that position, and also sharpens the sense, I hope, at least my readings do, of the negotiations that sort of prospect of assimilation entails. So I think at a moment where we see, that racialized, so the visibly racialized protagonist of the American dream, right, that sort of structures my work and in a way impels it, it's still held out. I mean, I think our moment has changed. When I first started, it was, I was looking at kind of early 2000s, right, where colorblind ideology seemed to be kind of taking hold in some ways. And now that's kind of been bared, right, as the sort of false ideology that it is. But I think that so there's a moment where we're seeing the entrenchment of racial inequality, even as I think racialized sort of characters are occupying sort of a center stage in the public imaginary, right? So there are realignments of race and class. So how do we hold those two contradictions side by side? I mean, I hope that the book can kind of help with that.
It does, I think, beautifully. And what's so amazing is the way in which you balance different immigrant experiences. I mean, you're thinking about lots of different transnational relationships in the immigration stories you look at. Can you tell us what some of those are? We know that Paule Marshall is from Barbados. Saund is from South Asia.
Yes. So, Villarreal is I work on Pocho because it's this paradigmatic text of racial treachery. And so that's growing out of a Chicano Mexican American history and context. And Ameen Rihani, the Book of Khalid is one of the central texts for me, and it's one of the early Arab American novels. And so the piece that I think isn't necessarily at the forefront, but it's part of the selection, is also that these are all colonial subjects in one way or another. So either we're talking about the sort of multiple colonialisms of the Americas that shape the figure of the Chicano, for instance, on the one hand, or British or French colonialism in the Middle East or the South Asian subcontinent, or in the Caribbean. But there's partly what I needed to do when I was thinking about race and character together was think about race in relation to immigration, but also in relation to coloniality, because these immigrants kind of bring with them that I guess baggage isn't the right word, but that particular form of subjection when they enter into the US. So, the Ameen Rihani example I gave, Bush takes this sitting president, right, takes this quote from 100 years ago and delivers it in a speech in the Middle East to sort of justify US intervention. And Rihani is writing at a moment where the prospect of US intervention in the Middle East is promising as a way to forestall the French and British mandate over the region. So, he's bringing that into the diaspora with him. So his work actually has some of those aspirations, but at the same time, it evolves as a figure, right, to be incredibly critical of US empire and intervention. And that sort of nuance, I think, gets lost in these appropriations of these figures. So yes, there are multiple trajectories, and I think each chapter tries to anchor the different figurations of character in these different histories.
Yeah, there is an incredible condensation on which that notion of character turns in your work. And it's really fascinating to hear you talk about the global scale, the historical scale, the political consequences in your work that comes from such careful, detailed, nuanced, close reading of literature. The literature itself is doing a whole lot of work. And so I'm just wondering two things. One, what happens when you do such vast and in-depth comparative work across colonial experience and ethnic experience in the US. And also, can you tell us a little bit about your method of close reading, where you're giving us such really detailed, beautiful, and nuanced engagement with form, with sentence, with image, plot, storyline, and characterization in these really different novels?
Yes, I mean, I think the real motivating, I think, impulse in a way of the work is to continue to discover the agency of literary critique and literary analysis and literature, right? For thinking through, for reading our social world in a more complex way. And so where the character formulation started was in a way of to grapple with the burden of representation of ethnic literature, which, you know, that phrase has come to us from ethnic studies and post-colonial studies to name the way in which readings of ethnic literature often collapse the writer with his or her social worlds, with their social worlds, and that, you know, the work is meant to speak for a community that the writer is, you know, said to belong to, right? And in a way correct a historical record. And this is important work, and there's a reason that this expectation is placed on these writings. I think what struck me was that there's actually, like, rather than collapse, how could we articulate these positions, right? The writer as a character in the social and historical record. So someone like Villarreal, who writes Pocho and is denounced for writing Pocho as a treacherous figure, as a Pocho himself, and then Pocho in the novel itself, and then Richard, the protagonist of the Pocho, whose story is like Villarreal's, but actually fictionalized. So the character function of the author in the text, right? How do we map that out? And to me, I think character critique and close reading provides that way of kind of accounting for those gradations of character. And what I talk about in the book in terms of a burden of signification of the concept of character, where, you know, we see a character and by which we could mean like a mark or, you know, a sign, right? A character is like a sign that concerns itself with the making of signs. And we read into that sign a whole host of figurative meanings. And this is not even just in literature, this is sort of in the world when we move through our social world, right? So if we could develop a vocabulary for talking about those leaps of figuration that we make, and then extend it to readings of these texts, then maybe we could develop a more complex sense of the relation the author has, the author Villarreal, in the historical record to the figure of the Pocho that he is constructing, right?
Is there a reflexive relationship then between these, you know, your genius work and these authors' genius work that is so aware really of the multiple and multivalent pressures on representation? Is there a reflective relationship between the work that they're doing, the work that you're doing, and that empty figure, that groove? Does the American dream and American character get changed in the hands of immigrant writers?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And I know we're being asked to wrap up, so maybe we can pick up on that in the Q&A. Thank you for those wonderful questions.
Thank you so much.
Wow, that was just as precise and engaged a conversation as the book itself is. So thank you both. We have questions. So Swati, your charge is to be profound, deep, and succinct and fast. Okay?
All right.
All right. Question number 1. Is the American dream pursued more by men than by women?
Okay, what were the things I have to be succinct, fast?
Don't worry about it.
Yes, I would say no, yes isn't the right answer. I would just say that I think the template of American character that I'm engaging with, the archetype, is a misogynist and a masculinist figure in many of its iterations. And maybe masculinist is the right word. That, if you take the trajectory from Benjamin Franklin through Horatio Alger, through Booker T. Washington, which then I extend to Saund, it's not an accident, I think, that most of the writers I work on in my book are men. So I would say yes, that I think the gendered aspect of that figure does need careful consideration. And, someone like Paule Marshall offers actually an opening into the critique, because she's thinking through Scylla's desire for upward mobility as emerging out of the precariousness of her position and her triple subjection as Black, as a woman, and as an immigrant.
All right. Is there a difference between first generation immigrants and the US born second generation? Mexican immigrants possessed a Mexican dream, which is the idea of returning to Mexico, while their US born children negotiated the American dream.
I mean, the whole sort of body of ethnic literature often organizes itself around these generational divides. And so they're absolutely different considerations, and then there's ways of parsing, like the first of 1.5, the second, right? I think that my work is less concerned along those lines, but more so just the way in which that template of the American dream, I think actually that character that solicits these immigrants obviously works differently on different generations, but it still has a certain pull and a certain solicitation. But that would be a great question to think through, right? Does the first generation that thinks of itself as, that's kind of sojourning, partly of its own volition and partly actually because in the period I'm looking at, exclusion is actually precluding any possibility of settlement, right? That if there's not a sense that you can naturalize and belong if that option isn't available to you, right? So there's a way in which looking back to the country that you've come from is a way of actually negotiating that barrier. But yeah, I think that would be worth thinking through some more.
Do the authors you study identify themselves primarily as writers and intellectuals? To be a writer or a public intellectual in the US is often difficult and uncertain, but the questioner imagines it would be even more difficult as an immigrant, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. To put it a bit differently, where does the position of writer or intellectual fall within the conception of the American dream and the success ideology often connected to it?
I mean, I think success as a writer of color, as an immigrant writer, is complicated. But absolutely, let me just draw the example of José Garcia Villa out. So he's a Filipino American subject of U.S. empire, living at the heart of empire, right? And so he very much proclaims himself to be, a writer, an intellectual, and he's not interested actually in a kind of minoritized identity. He doesn't want to be thought of as Filipino. He doesn't want to be thought of as racialized or as a colonial subject. So there is a kind of, but that claim is incredibly tenuous, right? That no matter how he might sort of imagine his self-articulation, that the only way he's legible in this kind of modernist milieu that he's writing in is as exotic and as other, and as fundamentally different. So I think that there are multiple scenes that I look at in my work and of writers who claim in a way a certain public persona, but also are constrained by what's actually available to them as immigrant writers, as racial figures.
Thank you. All right. You used the phrase immigrants enter into the American dream. The questioner is wondering whether the immigrants as individuals and their communities you studied had notions of the dream before arriving to America, or do their notions of upward mobility change after arriving to the United States?
I think the answer has to be both, right? A lot of these migrations are historically chain migrations. And so people come having and kind of join established networks. And so there is a sense that that mythology kind of carries with those networks in a way. But then also there are different modes of reality and experience that set in after the immigration in many ways. And I think this is clearest in someone like Paule Marshall, who's a second generation immigrant, is actually listening to her mother tell stories of her immigration and looking at her community, sort of grappling with, differential relationships to the American dream, right? Is it the choice to sort of choose the upwardly mobile path that is kind of founded on a denial of racial solidarity, a disavowal of racial solidarity, or are there more capacious models of Black identity and solidarity that could be imagined? And so the novel becomes a way actually of working out these different relationships to the American dream through different characters.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, a final question for you. Well, I have two in mind. This is hard. Okay, clearly your work, your critique, as you said, your literary analysis is doing some work that is designed to suspend the difference between literature and the real world, nonfiction life. What is it that you want this work to be doing? Just as, by the way, character suspends a certain line or crosses a line between textuality and creative writing and life. What is it? What kind of crossing are you trying to engender here or enable between literature, ethnicity, and the immigrant and the context?
I think that the very fact that character crosses that line, I think I would really, so it enables me to formulate a bridge, right? So character is a social construct and also a formal construct. And so the assonance there, the conceptual linkages that can be drawn, I think to me fundamentally speak to the agency of ethnic writers, that they're not, and I put this quote up in my presentation, that ethnic literature doesn't hold up a mirror to the world, but actually sort of reveals the writer's social function. And so that's the sort of distinction I want to draw out, that if we do these kind of evocative, close, rigorous readings that are also historically situated, that we might actually kind of unearth the agency that literature has. So the ways in which these writers are actually remaking our social world, retelling and telling a different story of the American dream, that's the sort of agency I want to draw out through their formal innovations and through their craft.
Thank you both so much. Please, everybody, buy this book and do fill out the survey as you exit our event, and also sign up for our IHC newsletter so that we can let you know when it is available to be rewatched. Have a wonderful afternoon, and again, many thanks.
Thank you.